second part on this section 7 is going to focus on the whole question of moral virtue and related aspects of that. The Catechism points out every Christian is called to a life of moral virtue, not just religious, so it's something really fundamental to our life. The moral virtues, in paragraph 1839, we're told, grow through education, deliberate acts, and perseverance in struggle. Divine grace purifies and elevates them. So we would say, philosophically speaking, the opposite of a virtue is a vice, but theologically speaking, it moves into the range of sin if it's a vice against God in some way. So I will allow you can go back and forth on both of those words. What we want to look at then is which kinds of vices and virtues are particularly helpful or harmful in relation to the new media. Because we have many virtues and vices. But I'm going to pick two big ones. The first virtue is going to be courage, and the related vice or sin is going to be sloth, which is what Sister Mercia just mentioned. John Paul II says that the essence of the internet is this fact that it provides an unending flood of information, which passes in a moment. And so what it does is it creates a response in us that may not necessarily be laziness. You may tend to think of sloth as laziness, but rather hyperactivity. And if you read the spiritual masters on what sloth really is, you'll see that it's associated with something other than just laziness. For example, Garrigou-Lagrange says, spiritual sloth is disgust for the spiritual things and for the work of sanctification because of the effort it demands. It's a vice directly opposed to the love of God and to the holy joy that result from it. Sloth engenders pusillanimity, or this resistance, especially in the face of duty. It also engenders discouragement and seeking after forbidden things. And so it may start really simply, somebody gets overstimulated by things, but in terms of religious life, the spiritual masters say it leads increasingly to a more and more difficult, for a greater difficulty in someone being able to actually live their vocation well. Joseph Pieper says sloth or acedia means that a man renounces the claim implicit in his human dignity. He does not want to be as God wants him to be. Ultimately, that means he does not wish to be what he really fundamentally is. While laziness can be described as doing nothing, Pieper characterizes sloth as a sense of restlessness, hyperactivity, frenetic work, often leading to despair. And then finally, this man, John Charles Naud, has a very interesting way of describing acedia or sloth as aversion to action, paralyzing the dynamism of action. It impedes communion with the other and the gift of self that enables it. He argues that the remedy then for this, he calls it a refusal of one's own greatness, is a renewed opening of the heart to the divine friendship of Jesus Christ and a true recovery of the true spiritual joy. And if we're working with people, younger sisters perhaps, who enter the community and haven't really faced this aspect of themselves, perhaps what was the residual effects of what they've been exposed to before, and we look at them and we think they just don't seem to be going anywhere. The question you might want to ask them is, have them read some of these things on spiritual sloth and see if it strikes a chord in them. And then find out, is it because they were overstimulated by all these sense images, perhaps even pornography, cyber sex, even, unfortunately, not the electronic media, but it could actually be hookups, lots and lots of sexual experiences where they don't have any relationship to the people, whether that's the deeper issue that's going on there. And it's not impossible, but it means the work is going to be a little more difficult for them. And often the media just kind of reminds them or can bring it back, the memories, the images. So that's the first one. They need great courage to actually go forward in that. The next virtues, these are the big ones, is temperance. And we can contrast that with the vice of intemperance or the sin of gluttony, which again also Sister Marisha mentioned. So not only does intemperance concern food in the sense of taste, but it can be also applied to our consumption of electronic media. Hugh MacDonald describes in an article called Asceticism and the Electronic Media the problem this way. The media serves to provide us with greater amounts of information. This is true even of the printed media, but it's more true of the electronic media, where we are provided not only with the entire world through symbols, but we're provided with the auditory and visual sensations of the whole world. The media would not continue to grow unless there were an immense appetite for knowledge, and such as it is today, he concludes, that appetite is disordered. Gluttony can be associated then with excessive use of electronic media out of curiosity or recreation. According to Thomas Aquinas, gluttony is the inordinate desire of eating, this desire for food not being regulated by reason. So you can see how analogically we can say, if we have an inordinate desire for information, one more search, one more this, one more that, it's also not regulated by reason. Hugh MacDonald further amplifies this aspect of vice and sin. Quote, the level of sensation present in our lives affects our intellectual judgment. And Thomas Aquinas discusses two related cases of intellectual debility arising from an imbalance in the sensory realm. The first is dullness of the intellectual sense, which arises from immersion in pleasures. The second is intellectual blindness, which arises from excessive fixation on pleasures. The dulling of the intellectual sense still leaves a functioning intellect. However, what a pure heart can see quickly, the dull of sense must labor to see. The intellect is lacking in penetrative power. So in the case of intellectual blindness, the intellect is completely unable to consider spiritual realities. And so this is why it's very difficult for people in formation if that's what they come in with, because they don't even see the spiritual realities. The other part just dulls the higher spiritual powers of intellect and will, in both cases. Apparently, this experience of their desire that can't be satiated for use of the electronic media can also be joined in many people to a passive kind of lifestyle, lacking in moderation in other areas of their lives. A Christian life has always been a struggle to overcome the tendency towards sin. And the spiritual writers, classical ones, often provide deep principles for this struggle. For example, St. John of the Cross in The Dark Night of the Soul observes how gluttony interferes with the relation between a person and his or her spiritual director, formator, or religious superior. Quote, the fragmented self rises up in many beginners, rebelling against wholeness, heightening sensual cravings, stirring gluttony, so that they cannot help but try to escape obedience. Submission becomes so distasteful to them that they're compelled to modify or rearrange or add to whatever is required of them, unquote. Very hard work indeed for an authority person with someone who has this problem. Another side effect of gluttony for electronic media is that persons who are consistently used to high levels of sensory stimulation seek for the same kind of experience in spiritual context. St. John of the Cross observes, quote, they, gluttonous persons, are so attached to reaping a sensual harvest that when no such feeling comes, they think they've failed. Don't they realize, he adds, that the sensory benefits are the least of the gifts offered by the divine, unquote. They have to really develop alternate experiences where they can, as we talked before about elation versus excitement. So that sets up the situation with the two big ones. Courage, in contrast to sloth. Temperance, in contrast to gluttony. And I've got in my next little section some humorous strategies for an examination. You've got them on your list here. We can ask a whole bunch of other ones, but we'll just take a quick look at them. And these are kind of things a sister could ask herself, and it's good to bring humor in because it's a very difficult, painful reality. And so if we can laugh at ourselves, it helps us a little bit more to decide to change, let's put it that way. So my first one is, am I an internet voyeur? Do I live through other people's experiences on reality shows as a substitute for the life I should be leading myself? Or in the case now I think of blogging or tweeting, it's the same thing. Am I living through somebody else? So it's a voyeurism, really, truly. The second part, am I an internet curious addict? Do I have to follow every step of a religious or secular media event, employing my intellect towards sensible matters that are not useful for my vocation, even if they're holy events? Sometimes we just find, I've got to see the next step. Who's going to be the next cardinal here, or the bishop there, or who's saying what about this, or anything. We just get caught up in this. So it's our curiosity that gets us totally attached and drawn away from what we're supposed to be doing. Am I an internet busybody? Do I eagerly listen to gossip? That's again, what is it, in the loggia? What is it? Whispers in the loggia. Okay. Do I run to it to see the gossip and on talk shows or newscasts so that I can pass it on to my sisters? You know, the first one to know, where it's not actually really a decision yet of who's going to be the cardinal somewhere. We just do it all the time, but how much? Am I an internet stalker? Do I have to see every appearance of a particular person, even someone we think of as a holy one, as a way of possessing another's identity for myself? Did you hear so-and-so was there? Let's see if we can draw up the picture, get the speech. I mean, I know I do it sometimes, so I'm sure others probably do too. But how much do I do it? Archbishop Chaput, I like to download everything he says. A little file, put it in there. Okay, the next one. Am I an electronic safe house? Do I fill my needs for love and friendship by the safety of cyberspace relations, rather than by deepening my relations with my sisters? And Sister Mirsh has already done some wonderful discussion of that. But if we think of ourselves with these kind of humorous terms, we can kind of say, well, yes, probably I am a little bit. Next one, am I an electronic tetherball? Do I feel empty and disconnected if I'm not attached to my cell phone, iPod, BlackBerry, or whatever? I might feel like I'm missing something. Finally, am I a jealous Jane? Do I compare the electronic device that I've been assigned with another sister's and think hers is better or mine's better? All those things of jealousy, envy, do they pop up here in the electronic world? Is my computer better or worse than someone else's? You know, all that. So we have all these same passions operating. It's just the object is moved towards something electronic. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we will admit that at times we are drawn more to the internet than simple conversations that it may be difficult or even not so difficult with our sisters. And if we reach a certain point and it becomes more than just occasion, then we have to really look at it and see if what our habits have become are interfering with this call to perfection that we looked at from the very beginning in our vocation, in our life, our call to union with God. As Peter Kreeft so aptly described it in his book Back to Virtue, if we can conquer everything else except ourselves, the result is that we do not hold the power. The media or the internet is always in the driver's seat instead of ourselves. Now, one of the remedies that I think we can come up with is electronic fasting. So I'm going to give some other suggestions, and again, it always depends on the relationship with your superior and your formator. You don't try fasting usually without permission, so you have to work this out in dialogue. But before I give you those examples, I want to give you a definition of virtue, which actually I read for the first time last night. There's a book that is called Saints in Verse by Frank Morris, and this Hannah Nevin, an elderly widow we know, gave it to me for Christmas, and I just saw it and picked it up for the first time to look at it. And I opened to this definition of virtue, and I love it. I think it's so perfect for what we're doing. Virtue is not in eating nothing, but in eating less when we desire more. I'll read that again. I thought that's just beautiful. Virtue is not in eating nothing, but in eating less when we're desiring more. So if we're thinking about electronic fasting, it doesn't mean we don't use any we go off and we start living in a world with nothing electronic. But it means in a situation where we find ourselves desiring more than we need or should, we just choose to do a little less. And that's the building of virtue, of temperance, and the courage to do it. Step by step, very small steps. So Hugh MacDonald is the one who brought up this example of electronic fasting. He says the right use of technology means we should also counteract its attractions. Communications technology concerns man's most basic appetite, the appetite to realize oneself through knowledge. However, the mere quantity of information may distract us from knowledge which is of true value. The most dangerous attitude is that of one who sits in front of the television set or computer terminal without a critical attitude. Since the machine is on, he takes up a passive and receptive stance. The Christian practices of fasting and abstinence, are perhaps easily compared with consciously limiting our use of the media, and yet that is what is required for mental and moral health, unquote. So a practical way, there are lots of different kinds of ways a person can do this, but a practical way would be to introduce periods of fasting from the use of internet if one experiences themselves as wanting more than one feels one should want at this point or actually act on. So for example, a sister might determine that she'll only check her email once a day and make this known to others who may want to contact her. Another sister may decide to fast from the internet on Fridays and offer this sacrifice as a prayer intention for another sister. I mean, there are ways, it's all the same principles of fasting but applied simply to electronic media. A superior might introduce community fasting from the use of internet during certain penitential periods. And I was thinking of in the medieval times, Advent and Lent were rather major penitential periods. And so it might be the case you would say, well, at least if your job or apostolic work doesn't require it, I won't use internet for Lent or something like that. It's rather extreme, but for us it's extreme. But that was very typical of the Christians in medieval times. Very massive amounts of self-denial. Another superior might suggest that Sundays be a day of Sabbath, and so on, instead focusing on adoration of God and recreation with the community. It's always better to have some positive reason, in my view anyway, why you're doing it, offering the sacrifice for someone, or the positive thing of spending more time with the community. But anyway, these are simple strategies. They place a determination for the use of the forms of new media in the context of regular dialogue and opening availability for a spirituality of communion among the sisters and also primarily with our Lord. Effective dialogue can help sisters become self-possessed of the values of spiritual combat and the ascetical life. And I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the traumatic repetition that my superior here in Denver at the time said, well, take a week off of looking at newspapers, listening to the radio or any television news about Columbine. And that was a very good experience. But she was the one that had to suggest it to me. I would have kept going. Because I think what happens when we get into those things, the intellect, the dulling of the intellect means we sort of lose that self-critical. Well, if I just read one more thing, that'll be enough. But it never is enough. See, that's the thing. It just keeps going. The next final thing is to develop further cardinal virtues and the little virtues. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but just to mention the virtue of practical wisdom or prudence, as I mentioned before, is doing the right thing at the right time, in the right manner, for the right reason, and usually to the right person. And the virtue of justice is giving God his due, basically. He gave us our life and our vocation and so on. So you can see how you could think about how you practice building up the virtue of justice in relation to electronic media. If we're taking all the time away from prayer or other things like that, then we're not giving him his due. Finally, I'd like to mention the little virtues. St. Francis de Sales is well known for having introduced the notion of little virtues, and I have a beautiful passage from one of his letters. He says, "Let us practice the little virtues. Such virtues are practiced running downward rather than climbing, but they may be best for our legs. Patience, helping our neighbors, service, humility, gentle courage, affability, tolerance, and our own imperfections, such are the little virtues. I do not mean we should not climb by prayer, but step by step," unquote. Now, in our own community, the little virtues were very important to our founders, Mother Catherine Macaulay, and so, in fact, our ratio, which is our plan of formation for the whole community, is built on those little virtues. In other communities, they may not be so emphasized. But Venerable Catherine says, "The little virtues are the means of forming the hearts of the sisters to be merciful in their apostolate, to give expression to the legacy of union and charity in their common life." And the ones she mentioned were humility, kindness, simplicity, patience, trust, gentleness, courtesy, and forbearance. And as I was looking at them, and I thought, what do we see in the content of television media, let's say? It's almost totally the opposite. Instead of humility, we see pride. Instead of gentle kindness, we see meanness. Instead of simplicity, we see complexity. Instead of patience, we see impatience. Instead of trust, we see distrust. Instead of courtesy, we see brutality. And instead of instead of gentleness, we see brutality. And instead of forbearance, we see lack of forbearance. We see all the opposites. So it made me think that the little virtues could also be very helpful in terms of a response to what we see on the media. So what it takes is an increasingly heroic witness, I think, of every sister and every community to look at those particular virtues that are important to their founder or foundress and how it relates to their community life, and step by step running downhill on them. That's it. So thank you very much.